Today for this important conversation. I especially want to thank our panelists for agreeing to come and share their leadership and their experience with us. I want to thank my colleagues from the Graduate School of Social Service, particularly the Center for Nonprofit Leadership, and Nancy Wackstein, who's the newest member of our team as our new director for the Community Engagement and Partnerships. So thank you for putting this important conversation together. It really is a case of good news and bad news. I mean, the good news is that you're all here willing and able and ready to engage this important conversation about what's happening in the nonprofit sector. The bad news is that the challenges and the changes in the nonprofit sector really make this conversation so critical. You know, the nonprofit sector certainly has had a history that has been defined by challenges, but what's happening socially, politically, economically in the United States as well as across the globe have really made these challenges of a different order. So it is a time where creativity and commitment is needed more than ever, and the fact that you're all here, as well as many, many of our colleagues across the country, give me great confidence that the sector will remain strong and the service and the leadership of the nonprofit organizations will prevail. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you everyone for agreeing to share your experience, and please come back often.
Thanks, Deborah.
Dropping everything, sorry.
It's early.
Well, thank you, Deborah and Dean McPhee, and please, and I'm glad to see you all at Fordham, and please come back to our school and to our Fordham Center. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I have great pleasure in introducing the newest member of our family, but I've known her for many, many years, Nancy Wackstein, who is the Director of Community Engagement and Partnership at Fordham. We started about a month, 2 months ago.
Three.
Oh, well, see how time flies when you're having fun, right? So, it's just been terrific. And I think many of you know Nancy. For 13 years, she was the Executive Director of United Neighborhood Houses in New York, and they oversee 38 settlement houses and community centers. And prior to that, she was the Executive Director of Lenox Hill. And she also was the director of the New York City Mayor's Office on Homelessness, so she knows a lot about this really, really serious issue. So I'm really, really pleased that she's joined us. And so without further ado,
Okay.
But I also see one of our partners, this is Francis Petit, our partner from the business school, Cabela School of Business. Just a little jet lag, just back from South Africa, but welcome. Okay, Nancy.
Great. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. And thanks, Elaine, and thanks, Deborah, and want to acknowledge the other folks from the School of Social Service who are here, the Associate Dean Manoj Pardesani, who was right there and left. Morning, Allison.
Hi, I'm sorry.
No, we're just starting. Why this panel at this time? I think many of you know that in the wake of the collapse of FEGS, probably about a year ago now, there was a lot of soul searching in the nonprofit community and government as well, like what happened? What could possibly have happened? This was the largest social service agency in the city. How could it have collapsed overnight? And that led to a whole lot of questions about government practices, about nonprofit practices, and Allison Sesso, who's, well, you could tell who Allison is because she's the woman, led through the Human Services Council, of which she's the executive director, led a commission that was formed with a lot of, I think, very experienced players in both fields, three fields, philanthropy, government, and nonprofit, to look at what the factors were that led to the demise of FEGS and what other kinds of risks exists for the nonprofit sector in New York City and beyond. So that's the timing of this event, and I just, for those, I'm sure everybody in this room knows why this matters. Social services in New York City are delivered primarily by nonprofit organizations, whether it's homeless shelters, mental health programs, after-school programs, childcare, senior centers. Every social service in New York City is delivered under contract with nonprofits, so the health of nonprofits should matter to all of us if we care about social services, if we care about poor, vulnerable, marginalized people, because it is the nonprofits who make sure that they are taken care of against great odds, as you will hear. So it's my privilege to introduce our panel. Can't lean over like this. To introduce our panel, and I'll go in alphabetical order. Phil Conte, raise your hand, Phil, is Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the Africa Center, and he'll, I'm sure, tell you more about what the Africa Center is. Phil has a lot of experience in the nonprofit world. He was the Chief Financial Officer for the Museum of the Moving Image. He was Vice President at the Georgia Aquarium in Atlanta, which I understand from your bio is the world's largest aquarium. Who knew? It is. And before that, Phil was with the Wildlife Conservation Society, which we all know here is running the Bronx Zoo and other important cultural institutions. But perhaps most importantly, Phil is an adjunct professor at Fordham's Center for Nonprofit Leadership, and he teaches in the Joint Nonprofit Leadership Program from the School of Social Service and the School of Business, the Gabelli School of Business that you heard about a moment ago. And Phil earned his MBA from Fordham's Gabelli School of Business and his Bachelor of Business Administration also from the Gabelli School. So welcome, Phil. Sesso comes before Schack. Okay, Allison Sesso, at the very end there, has served as the Executive Director of the Human Services Council of New York since March 2014. Wow, Allison, 2 years. And previously served for many years as the Human Services Council's Deputy Director. For those who don't know, the Human Services Council is the major coalition of human services nonprofits in the city, and I'm sure Allison will tell you more about what they do, but they are probably the leading voice for nonprofits on the city and state level, human services nonprofits on the city and state level. Allison has overseen disaster recovery and preparedness efforts on behalf of the nonprofit sector, particularly post-Sandy. She is helping to formulate recommendations around the implementation of a value-based payment approach in the world of Medicaid managed care. That is pushing that rock uphill, Allison, but thank you. Thank you for your service. Allison is, as I said, a passionate voice for the importance of the human services sector and its staff and its underserved, undercompensated, undervalued staff, and so thanks for your leadership on that. Allison has an MPA from Baruch, and I thought it was important to note that Allison is also the board chair of a nonprofit called Hollaback, because it's important to understand how boards function in this nonprofit sector, and Allison has firsthand experience. Last but certainly not least, my old friend Fred Schack. Fred's a social worker. Fred has an MSW, happy to say. Fred is the CEO of Urban Pathways, which is a not-for-profit social service and supported housing organization serving homeless adults in the New York metro area. And he's been he started in 2005, wow, as executive director. Fred is a leader in the field of homelessness and homeless housing. He is a founding member and past president of Homeless Services United, the coalition of agencies serving homeless New Yorkers. He has been on the board of the Human Services Council. He is the vice chair of the Board of Supportive Housing Network and on the board of NASW, New York City chapter. So Fred is committed to helping to build the sector, not just his own organization, but he's done that very well. The Urban Pathways has developed over 600 units of affordable and supportive housing during your tenure, is that right, Fred? Yeah. And Fred has, as you can imagine, a long history in the field. He has his MSW and his BA from Rutgers, and I read in his bio that he is currently a lecturer teaching homeless policy at the Columbia University School of Social Work, Fred, so we're going to have to get you to come here. It's shocking that you're in Columbia, not here. So thank you, all of you, and thank you for coming. As I said, this is a really, really important time for the nonprofit sector. In my more than 3 decades in working in the nonprofit and governmental sector, I have never seen a time when it is more difficult for nonprofits to manage and to succeed than it is now. And I'm sure these folks will tell you why that is, assuming you agree. It is one of the hardest jobs in the world to run a nonprofit and to be the CFO of a nonprofit. And so they will tell you why they think it's a difficult time, but what hope there is for the future. And I thought, Allison, we should start with you because as I said, the Human Services Council has recently issued a report, what's it called?
Nonprofits in the aftermath of FEGS, a call to action, and I call it, in short, some people call it the FEGS report, I prefer to call it a call to action.
A call to action.
Or the call to action.
And I believe we have copies of the executive summary of that report outside, if you haven't seen it. I mean, the whole report is worth reading, but in case you're busy, the executive summary is out there. And Allison, why don't you tell us why now, why you undertook this investigation, what it tells us, and what's the call to action?
Yeah, sure. So, well, thank you for having me, and congratulations on nabbing Nancy Wackstein. She was actually the board chair of HSC for a little while, and on our board and executive committee for a long time.
A little while.
Okay.
Felt like a long time to me.
I don't think it was long enough that you were our chair, because she really was a great partner. So, and I apologize for rushing in here. I will tell you that at the beginning of doing this report, I basically put this commission together, and then I went and had a baby, and so he's one now. Following the FEGS timeline. And so I have a tight window in the morning that is has limited flexibility, so I apologize for that. So why did we do this? So
Fordham is a family-friendly place.
yes, exactly. I thought you guys would be understanding. I didn't think I was going to be judged. So we did this. So FEGS happened, and I think if we didn't do this, it would just be another story that we sort of said every now and then, and I don't think it would be getting I don't think the sector and these issues would be getting the attention that they're getting. And so we sort of said, okay, this terrible, scary thing happened. We saw it, I think, as a Lehman Brothers moment, as I like to say it, for our sector, where we all were sort of looking at each other like, how did this happen? How did we not know this was coming? How did nobody realize this was coming? And are we all potentially ready to fall? Like, are we all vulnerable here? And so we decided that it was important for us to take a look at why not only FEGS went down, but why other nonprofits had gone down. And I think before this FEGS had happened, there was this sense that it could only happen to the small guys and that it was like a market thing and it was okay. And it was sort of like, well, this is America and markets do what they do, and it includes the nonprofit sector, and it's okay. And so, and then when FEGS happened, I think people were like, okay, so it's not about size. Clearly, this was the biggest. And also, this had, because of its size, I think people were scrambling to try to find places for these services. It had a big impact on the number of staff it impacted. the debt was considerable, so the banks were like, what? And then this starts drying up, the ability of nonprofits to borrow money, which is really problematic. So I think because of the size, it really was a moment. And we wanted to make sure that we offered a counter dialogue to what was sort of seeming to be out there. And I think oftentimes as a sector, we fail to do that. And that allows other people to tell our story. And I think they tell it incorrectly. And they blame the nonprofit itself. There's a lot of blaming the FEGS management. And I just want to be clear, I'm not blaming the FEGS management. I think very clearly in this report, we talk about the fact that as managers of nonprofits and boards of nonprofits, you have a responsibility to own and understand the realities of the very, very, but increasingly risky environment that we're operating in. But at the same time, I think we needed to take a moment to understand why and what are the causes and drivers of all of these risks that we're forced to work in, and why are we making it harder for people to do services that I think we all agree are critical to New York's. And I go beyond that it's just helping the most vulnerable. I think we as a sector use that language a lot, but I actually think it helps the overall prosperity and global competitiveness of all of our systems. I think it works in tandem with education systems and health systems and fills in a lot of gaps that otherwise wouldn't let those sister systems, including business, be as successful. And I also want to point out, Nancy, at the beginning you talked about philanthropy, nonprofits, and government wasn't at the table very purposely in this. But we did actually have business interests at the table, and I think that was an important point here too. And the point of this report was to make sure that we told the story not to the nonprofits or the funders of nonprofits, but to tell the story to the rest of the world, who really, I think, don't understand not only the problems that we're facing, but even how our model works, or what we do. I think I think we have a marketing problem as a sector, which I'm trying to tackle, and this was one of my inroads to doing that. I often call us a ghost industry. We're sort of out there doing all this great work and filling in these gaps, but there's not a recognition of just how vast our sector is as a whole, that we are interconnected. There's this sense that we're funded primarily with philanthropic dollars, and there's not an understanding that we're primarily contracted with government, that our dollars come from government sources. And that we're, run on volunteers that are professional, we're not really professionalized, and I think that has a lot to do with why our wages are so low in our sector. So I think that story isn't told in a meaningful way, and we kind of wanted to take this opportunity, as we saw it as an opportunity, and as opposed to having the world tell our story, and so those nonprofits, again, we try to rely on them, but they can't seem to get it together to sort of explain what the real circumstances were going on. So that's why we did it.
And do you, well, maybe we'll get to that, but Fred, you were a member of this commission, which is one of the reasons we invited you. And I wonder if you or Allison can briefly tell us what you see the challenges for the nonprofit sector are. And again, maybe at the end of this, we'll talk about what the opportunities are as well. But as somebody who runs a nonprofit, what did this report mean to you?
Okay, so for me, when I think back to my earlier career, I spent the first 16 years working in child welfare. And I would tell my staff that we were operating in a system that was designed to fail, and that their job was to figure out a way, in spite of the design, to make it work. I carried that same principle as a manager of an organization, sort of recognizing what the risks are, preparing for those risks, planning for those risks so that you can avoid those risks. So for us as an organization, and sort of going through the report, it was very enlightening for me as a manager, and so you sort of do some of these things intuitively. I tend to be risk averse as an individual, and recognizing that it's important to understand all of the elements within either regulations or within contracts, looking at the economics of your organization and managing so that you're able to ensure the viability of your organization. So that was sort of part of my management style and my management approach. But I didn't have an idea of what our debt ratio was. I wasn't looking at those numbers. I wasn't looking at my cash flow with any consistency. And actually, I started doing it at the very beginning of this process and recognized that, as the report from Sea Change talks about, we are distressed. We're not on the verge of failure. But when we look at the available cash flow that we have as an organization, we recognize that we are in distress. So what it forces us to do is to begin having a dialogue, not only with management, but also with your board, and engaging your board in the process of understanding what the risks are, setting some goals and some targets, and then planning activities that will help you get there.
Fred, can you just, for people to understand what's the budget size of your organization and how many staff do you have?
So we have 300 employees. It's about $20 million operating budget. And we develop affordable housing. We develop supportive housing. We operate shelters, drop-in centers. So all of our contracts are with the state of New York, with the city of New York, with the federal government, and we have some very small contracts with the Port Authority. So it's very heavily government funded. The design aspect has to do with the fact that, we are grossly underfunded by our government partners. And I refer to them as partners. They don't always operate that way, but the reality is that we have a dependency on them, but they grossly underfund us. So one of the conversations I have with my board, and I've been having this conversation for 10 years, as we grow as an organization, the total dollar amount that we have to raise privately goes up. So the percentages may stay the same. We really work hard to try to maintain those percentages, but recognizing that growth means that we're going to have to be more effective and more, more able to go out and find private dollars. So there have been times in the organization's development where we've had to step back and ask ourselves, do we have the capacity to raise an additional $1 million a year privately? And if the answer is no, then maybe this is a contract that we can't take.
Fred, can you just talk a little more for people who may not be familiar? So a government contract will typically provide you, like, what percentage of your actual
It varies.
costs?
I would say on the low side about 80 cents on a dollar. On the high side, maybe 87, 90 cents on a dollar. But there's always going to be this element that's not funded. And the reality is what they'll do is they'll provide, and this is in child welfare and in homeless services, and I've worked in several of the industries, they'll provide you the dollars necessary to address the programmatic issues. In most cases, not always. But what they don't do is they don't take care of the things that you have to be responsible for in order to keep the lights on. So, making sure that you have an accounting department that can make sure that you're doing your collections in a timely fashion, making sure that your IT systems are able to manage the reporting responsibilities necessary to understand what the environment is sort of presenting you with, making sure that you're able to handle your leasing responsibility. And the other thing they do in their contracts is that typically, and Allison and I have been having this conversation for at least 5 or 10 years,
Yeah.
There are no escalations. So typically you'll enter into a 5-year contract with the city or a 10-year contract, but it's flat funded. So in year 1, it works perfectly fine. In year 2, your HR costs have gone up, your health insurance costs have gone up, your leasing costs have gone up, your contract has remained flat. So what we do is we play this game where we basically reduce the support for our PS, our personal services side, in order to take care of all of those things you absolutely have to do in order to maintain your presence in the industry.
Nancy, I'll just add to that in terms of, we cite in the report, just for simplicity reasons, that it's 80 cents on the dollar. And obviously it varies within contracts, but sort of like on average. And I think it doesn't, and given the cost escalation issues, but then Fred didn't even mention on top of that, there's unfunded mandates oftentimes, so that this government will decide to pass a policy, and it could be as big as, there's a new minimum wage, and we're not going to fund you for it. Or as small as, in this service area, you need to now, all of your employees have to take a certain type of training, and you have, we're not paying for it, but you have to make sure that they're all trained in this, specific thing. Those types of costs add up in this environment where you're only getting 80 cents on the dollar, and there's sort of like no, and when 80 or in a lot of cases 90+% of your budget is coming from underfunded sources, it doesn't take, a genius to figure out why there's underfunding and chronic problems in the nonprofit sector. And the problem is that it's not getting any better, it's getting worse. The budget just came out yesterday with the de Blasio administration, who's, I think, more friendly to the sector than Cuomo, and he did not include a cost of living adjustment in the budget for nonprofits. I mean, he did one last year at 2.5%, which, by the way, has still not gotten out the door to nonprofits. So it was passed in July 1, and it should have been out the door very soon, and it's still not there. And so, these, on top of all of this, it's like they're always adding sort of on top, piling on. And I would say what ends up happening, and it's a very good point that Fred's talking about in terms of the not funding the institution itself. So they focus so intently on program, and how they define program is so limited that they don't allow you to cover your other costs, which ironically undermines your ability to be a good steward of public dollars. Because you can't have the systems in place that allow you to see the problems coming and do the risk management and do the strategic planning that'll let you even fill the gaps in time to do this. And so that you end up with this situation where you're constantly operating in emergency management mode, and you're living month to month as opposed to really thinking 5 years ahead, because you don't have the staff or capacity or bandwidth to be able to do that.
Well, I think, Allison, it may go back to your earlier point that there's a perception that these are sweet little charities, not very complicated businesses. And that, I think that's part of the perception and reality problem. So I think we should go back to what the commission recommended, but first let's hear from Phil. Phil, you've had a diverse experience inside the city, outside the city. So as somebody who tries to deal with the financial part of these businesses, these complicated businesses, what's your take on the sector today?
Well, first of all, I think everyone loves the finance department, so that's the first thing I want to say. So, it's pretty clear.
Especially at budget time.
Yeah, especially at budget time. Everyone loves the finance department. I think that one of the things that I've been blessed with in my career is not only entering the nonprofit sector and working on it at different institutions all over the United States for different organizations, but I focus primarily on turnarounds and taking nonprofits that are in situations like this and turning them around. And really what I think the key element that comes down to it, and I say this, I think there's a few of my students here, so they've heard this before, is, to me, and I tell this to my board of trustees or to boards that I advise, the only difference between a non-for-profit and a for-profit is how we file our taxes. That's it. That's the only difference. The profit that we create, and I'm going to use the word profit, not surplus and deficit, but the profit that a nonprofit makes is in the good that we're doing as opposed to making the share price go up 2 cents in the quarter. So the real difference comes down to is to how we're operating our business. And clearly we have to do programs, and that's the main mission of what we're doing. But being good stewards and being good fiduciaries of that nonprofit means looking at the infrastructure that you have. And to go back to one of the best examples, when I first entered the nonprofit world was at the Bronx Zoo. I'm sure everyone here has been to the Bronx Zoo. Everyone loves to hear my animal stories at the Bronx Zoo. This won't be an animal story. But, here you have a 5 million visitor institution with a $250 million operating budget and a $800 million endowment. They're not small. And everything was promoting families and bringing families, and this was in the late 90s, bringing families, but nobody wanted to repair the sidewalks. Every dollar that we got went to animal conservation or land conservation or research. 95% of every single dollar went towards the mission-related activities. And while that sounds wonderful, we had to come back and say, but we're inviting all these families here and you can't push, we have no ADA access. We have staircases from the 1880s that are here. You can't push a stroller anywhere in this place, yet we're inviting, tens of thousands of families to come here, telling them we're family friendly. We can't do our mission because of all these backbone and infrastructure issues. And the same thing happens in the human services sector in terms of dealing with what is our cash flow, how far are we projecting out, what are we paying our people. If we paid them more, we'd have less turnover and things would be a different situation. So you really need to look at not only what you're doing with your money, but what is the business plan of this organization? And it's not how we're going to make it through next year's approved budget, it's what are we going to do 10 years from now. And I think that in reading this report, it was a fascinating report, because even though I teach in the social service school and the business school, and I'm familiar with this, there are so many things that just from a business standpoint, people would look at it, and particularly board members should be looking at this and saying, what? What do you mean we're not doing RFPs? We're not getting 5 vendors and picking out the best one from them. We're not looking at our cash flow and what is our line of credit in terms of, are we looking at a 1-month line of credit or a 9-month line of credit for certain situations that are coming up? So I think really, and in particular with this service industry, the risk, and you can just think about some of your own personal business. If you run a company and 85% of your business is one client, and we'll just call that client government, that can only go on so long. It can only go on so long before, whether you're a $1 billion company or a $500,000 company, you're going to hit a crisis like this. You cannot have that much risk in one thing. And that's what I think nonprofit management and boards need to really take a look at. And a lot of the recommendations that are in this report are business practices that are out there that need to be implemented into the nonprofit world. And some of the times that means not doing less mission, but just being more selective of mission programming, so that you're alive 5 years from now to continue it. I think that's one of the key takeaways.
Yeah, and you know, Phil, since I want to get to the recommendations and hopefully and hopefully on an up note, but you mentioned boards, and I guess and many people, when FEGS went down, said, well, where was the board? Where was the board oversight? Isn't that their job? And I wonder, Fred, if you running an organization, if you can comment on that. What is the board's role? Was there culpability here? And how can we get boards more involved in what they should be involved in without trying to take over the executive director's role, which I think everybody is sensitive to?
So I think a lot of it depends on the viewpoint of the CEO. When I accepted the position I'm in currently, I did it because I was looking for a board that would be in partnership in helping me manage the organization. I wasn't looking to fly solo. So I was very interested in making sure that it wasn't a board in name only. And I've worked in organizations where we were well managed, but the board would show up, they get a report, and they go away, and they write a check. And that was their role. And part of the pressure for doing that is the fact that you've got to fill this gap. So when organizations are looking to select board members, are they interested in whether or not the person is, going to help them review their financials and provide them with guidance, or are they interested in knowing whether or not that person can write that $15 or $20 million or $20,000 check? And if it's one or the other, what are you going to choose? And the reality is a lot of organizations are more interested, because of survival, in making sure that they have the capacity to give. So even if you're not going to get engaged in the work, if you're going to write that check, if you're going to give us your list of contacts, and we're going to raise $100,000, then you're on, okay? My position has been to try to encourage board members and to attract board members who have degrees in law and who are practicing lawyers, who are in finance, who have experience in HR and in organizational management, and to really engage them. It's not always easy because some board members really just want to write the check, okay? So you've got to figure out a way to do that. But we've got to change the environment because, I explained to my board that they have a fiduciary responsibility, okay? So they need to be aware of what we're doing, how we're getting it done, and quite frankly, I'm a social worker by training. We are, I'm now a housing developer, okay? But, I don't come from a finance background. So I've learned it going along, but I really do rely on board members to help me sort of sort it out and figure it out. And there's not enough of that going on. And I think that one of the things this report really talks about is the fact that, in spite of the fact that there are lots of risk out there, and the system is really not designed to work, it is our responsibility, and it can work, and it can work well. But it really is a matter of the choices that we make as managers and the choices that we make as board members.
Okay, so let's get to it now. So this is the reality. It's been going on for decades. What can we do to change it? Allison, you said earlier, the city always describes the nonprofits as their partners. It's like domestic violence, though. That, what can we do, we as a sector, we as a field, really, do to change that? Because you're right, we have I think, an administration that at least rhetorically says they believe in social services, they want to support social services. We haven't always had that coming out of the mayor's office, but so is this a moment when we can make change, and what would that be? What would that look like?
Well, I do think it's not just because we put this report out, it's that they're not going to be like, oh, now we get it. Like, they understood that they were underfunding us before this report.
Right.
I think what we're trying to do is leverage a more public conversation, and politics and pressure from around that is what moves things in this city, the state, and this nation. So that's the angle that we're sort of saying, which is why, again, we led with a piece in the Wall Street Journal when we released this report, and we hired a very skilled PR consultant to help us make this a more public issue. I mean, that was very strategic on our part, and I think that's important, and I don't want to undercut that. You can be right all you want, but you need to matter, and so we're trying to matter. I would say my favorite recommendation in this report is the last one, which is the one that's going to, I think, keep this report active, and that is us as a sector rating, and HSC is starting to develop this. We're about to hire a consultant, actually, to begin the implementation of this recommendation. And there's two elements to it. We're basically going to rate government agencies in a Yelp kind of way. So we're going to rate government agencies and sort of ask sector leaders to anonymously give their opinion on how different government agencies are faring in terms of their payment rates, their timeliness, things of that nature and that matter. And then we will put that out in a very public, strategic way, in a report card kind of way, the way that the Strap Hangers campaign does it for the subways, and hopefully that helps to put some pressure on them to address some of these other recommendations that are in the report and bring us to the table in a meaningful way. And the other one, which I think is really important and will both, I think, push government, but also going back to your point about boards, will, and by the way, I do think boards, based on this report, are much more aware and being like, wait a minute, what? And so I do think boards are starting to pay more attention to these issues, as are executive directors. But the other recommendation is related to rating RFPs as they come out. So when government puts a proposal forward, rating it for risk, and we're going to come up with a set of criteria and rate them and say, this is how risky this potentially is. Now, that's a challenging thing to do because every nonprofit is a little bit different, and how risky it is depends on your own model and what you have at the table. But I do think that we're able to still come up with a system in which we can say, this is red or green or yellow. I'm not sure what the scale is going to be, if it's going to be a letter system. We have all that to develop. But I think that will really help change the conversation. And I do know that many of my members are increasingly deciding to not renew contracts.
Really?
And are giving contracts back and are staying out of the competition. And so this is affecting the competition overall.
But Allison,
yeah.
That's come up over the years. Well, if the terms with the city are so bad, why do nonprofits take those contracts?
It's true.
Why do they choose to take them? Why don't they just walk away? And I remember having this conversation over several years with the settlement houses, and the issue always was, well, communities need this service, and if we don't do it, somebody who's worse will come in. We have a mission that we have to fulfill to our community. And third, if we walk away from the contract, somebody else will do it.
Well, but I think-
so it doesn't matter.
I think that there's a point. Yeah,
It's
go ahead.
also important to understand that government cannot do this without us. So the ability to say no becomes a very powerful instrument in getting movement on the part of government. They can't do this work without us being a part of that process. So I think we have to be willing to say to a contract, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to bid for it. We're not going to compete for it because it doesn't work. So there's a contract that was just issued, or an RFP that was just issued by the State Office of Mental Health for scattered site housing.
Fred,
Yeah, there was a contract that was an RFP that was just issued by OMH for supportive housing, scattered site. It's funded at, I think it's $15,800 a year in a New York City rental market where it is impossible to find housing that you can rent for under $1,100, $1,200. So if you're spending $13,000 a year rather, just for the leasing costs, you have absolutely no money in there to provide services. So what people are beginning to do, and that's been the model, and you sort of figure out ways to make it work. You figure out how you can get economies of scale, you figure out how you can leverage other resources, but at some point you have to say, you know what, this model is structurally unsound, and we're just not going to respond. So organizations are beginning the process of sending in letters to the state basically saying, we're interested in serving this population, it's consistent with our mission, we think we can do it well, but we can't do it at this number.
and our organization's going to stick together on that? I mean, that's always, you know, or are there going to be people who peel off and say, we'll do it?
I think there'll be always people that are going to do it. I think
Yeah.
that's inevitable, and I think we have to own that. And I think that that's kind of okay. It's not ideal in terms of from an advocacy perspective where I said I would love the ideal world where it's they've all grouped together. But I think if we can point out that the competition is being squashed and that fewer people are bidding, and have the people that are actually responding be questioned a little bit more in a public way. You know, if you put out a really risky rating on an RFP and you say, okay, well, these 3 people still bid, and we are working with the press to sort of say, look, like there's, it doesn't mean that you don't apply for a risky RFP. I think you can't apply for all risky RFPs. So you can apply for a risky RFP. You have to do it with your eyes wide open, though. And you have to know how you're going to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, Phil, I know.
Well, I agree, and I think that, saying no to many things is some of the best things that as an executive director, you can do. And that includes board members. There's not, if you have a bad employee, you can get rid of that employee. If you have a bad board member, you can get rid of that board member. You can. I've done it. It's not pretty sometimes, but you have to be able to do it. And I've gotten rid of multiple board members that are not doing what they should be doing. They're not filling their roles and responsibilities. They're simply writing a check and walking away, and there's more to it than that. While the check is nice, it's not the whole reason of being a board member or trustee in the organization. Saying no to things that, if the RFP is a bad RFP, or if you have an organization that the mission match isn't there, you're selling your integrity. And I can tell you from being the chief financial officer and having the CEO come into my office saying, we just got this grant. We just got this wonderful grant. Just sign, Phil, and we're going to be able to get this. And I've looked at it and said, but this is not exactly what we're supposed to be doing. Yeah, but it's 7 figures. And we're going to be able to make this thing work. And, I sort of give the example in class. I'm like, well, our nonprofit's about cats, and this program is about dogs. We shouldn't be doing this. It's not related to us. They're like, yeah, but it's 7 figures, and we're going to make it talk about how cats work with dogs. And, by doing that, we're going to be able to fulfill the grant terms, we're going to be able to get the money, and their indirect is 14%. So let's take it. Let the other organizations take that. Don't sell your soul. Don't change your mission match just to get that dollar. And same thing with the RFP. Yeah, you may lose 1 or 2, but in the long run, you're going to be a stronger organization, a better organization, have better PR, and you will be sustainable in the long run by making those no decisions at those early stages.
Yeah, it's not just about reputation. It's not just about financial risk. It's about reputational risk as well.
Reputational risk.
Yeah, Fred.
And that's a very important point. I mean, the reality is that, how do you what is the role of your CFO in your organization? Is that a partnership between the CEO and the CFO? or is it a subordinate relationship? And does your CFO have the ability and the competence to speak directly to the board as it relates to risk within the organization to do that alert? Because again, I know some of my colleagues, we have big egos, we want to manage our organizations, we've got it all together,
Yeah.
we're in charge, okay? And that doesn't work. These are very complex organizations. You can't know everything, and you need to have a CFO who's competent and who's courageous, willing to take, there's risk associated with saying no to your boss.
And
okay?
empowered, yeah.
Yeah.
empowered.
And you can be unpopular at times. Now, for better or for worse, typically when I've been brought on board to organizations that are at the bad stages, so they're used to hearing the tough medicine talk. But I think, and I've noticed this in a lot of nonprofits that I've just given advice to on a pro bono basis to help them out with different things. Again, it relates back to all of our efforts are headed towards the mission, and all of our dollars are headed towards the mission. And so a lot of the paperwork, particularly with organizations that have a lot of grants and government contracts, there's a difference between having your finance department push paper versus analyzing risk. And a lot of organizations are hiring low-end situations and bookkeepers to push paper because of the sheer volume of the paper. Again, we're talking about 80 to 85% government contracts and grants, whether it's federal, state, city, county, whatever it is. It's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of reporting, there's a ridiculous amount of auditing that in this report clearly denotes should not be there. But it's a lot of sort of background stuff that you're paying some low-end bookkeepers to push through. Well, they're just pushing it through. They're not analyzing, is this right, is this risky? And you may not have the financial wherewithal to be able to hire a CFO that can do that, but the same way that we talked about your 10-year plan for the organization, and I agree with what both of you had said, I have a 10-year plan for my board of trustees. And looking at which trustees we can bring on board, and maybe they can't write the biggest checks, but I've got a strong finance group that can help with the audit and analyze things, and I've got a strong marketing group that's helping with the marketing, and then I've got a few people that are really good check writers, and they can handle the gala and that kind of stuff too. But you need to have a strategic plan for your board as well as your organization to make all these pieces fit together, because that will help alleviate some of the expenditures that you have to analyze from the finance piece.
I want to touch on something that you've all raised. There's this sense, I believe, that the way to deal with this flawed business model, which we've all just discussed, is to grow. And that I think a lot of boards feel, well, bigger is better. So if you get the $2 million new contract, wow. I remember when I was running a settlement house, we want to be as big as Henry Street. There's the competition. Bigger means you're more important, you're more influential, and they want to sit on a board that's important and influential. So let's grow. Let's bring on more contracts. Let's bring on more contracts without, I think, as somebody said, understanding that you bring on a contract, you bring on a deficit in general. But so what about that? Is bigger better? Can you grow your way out of this structural model that's broken?
No. And I think the other thing, especially if your main funder is government, I mean, one of the things that we talk about here is the idea that philanthropy cannot and is not interested in filling in this gap. And I have to say, one of the other things is I've been engaging the philanthropic community to be more active and be partners and talking to the government and saying, we're part of this equation too. And for philanthropy, by the way, to change their own behavior first and then go to the government and say, we're changing, you need to change too. You're the big elephant in the room here. As one philanthropist that was involved in the commission work said at a setting like this, she said that, philanthropy in terms of dollars is like a flea on the back of an elephant. It's nothing. Then there's no way you can fill that gap. I mean, the city and state in New York City spent almost $6 billion on social services.
Yeah, but
So-
the private foundations are beginning to, and I think that they've been influenced by this report. We have a Robin Hood grant, and the annual report that we were required to do this year asked about our ratios, the debt ratios. It asked about our cash flow. It asked about our line of credit, really looking at the health of the organization. And it also asked us to identify what we anticipated to be risks going forward to the organization and how we plan to address those. So I think that this report has been very helpful in getting the entire community to begin looking at the health of not-for-profits. And I also think that the foundation community will begin the process of recognizing that they also can't put arbitrary caps on the non-program related costs.
Right.
So they're beginning to recognize that they've got to pay for your IT and they've got to pay for your back office if you're going to effectively deliver the service.
It's interesting to me, in terms of organizational infrastructure and staff, that, here at Fordham, and I'm sure at many other academic institutions, faculty are doing wonderful research about how important the continuity of engagement is between social workers, clients, case managers, clients, how important that continuity is. But yet there's just this chasm between that research and what we know is good practice and the ability to retain staff, because you don't get cost of living increases, your health benefits are eroding, you don't get professional development. So it's so interesting to me to observe in my 3 months here the gap between what the researchers approve work in helping people and how we are set up as a business to do that or not.
Well, and that's only going to get worse, I mean, I think that we were big proponents of raising the minimum wage, and I continue to stand by that. I think, that is a great anti-poverty, policy. I think that's huge, that's incredible. But at the same time, we're in this situation in which that means an additional cost for the people that I represent. And so it's a very tricky, fine line to be walking, because big picture, it's the right thing, and it reduces how many people need our services, and we want to pay our workers better. But if the government doesn't, and because they're our primary payer, if they're going to lift everybody up to 15, even if they pay for that, if they're not doing something for the rest of the workforce, you end up with this compression. And so you're getting rid of some of these career ladders, and you're undermining the professionalism of the rest of the workforce because you're not raising them up and keeping those important gaps between the bottom and everyone else in place. And so I'm very concerned about the impact of the minimum wage on our workforce for that reason.
Yeah, I think, Phil, you were going to say something before.
I was just going to say about your first question about organizations getting bigger, and we all said no, I think, at the exact same time. I think one of the things that, because a lot of nonprofits do that, and they compare themselves to whoever the leader is in their particular field.
Right.
And one of the things that I always say is that there's a vast difference between nobility and reality. And a lot of nonprofits are, well, we're going to save the world in our little section. And and it's great to have those lofty goals, but you need to have the reality of what's happening in your world. So if you're saving the planet, and in some way we all are, whether it's through human services or cultural services or conservation efforts or whatever it is, you still need to be able to have the reality of, well, it needs to start in this 200 square piece. And how are we doing it? And if that may mean doing less programs and taking, not as much risk with what we're doing, actually having, it's okay on your balance sheet to have cash. It's okay. It doesn't have to be that red deficit line all the time. Because guess what? And you bring up a wonderful example of it. Anyone in this room would love to have a Robin Hood grant.
Or so they think.
Or so they think.
Right.
But don't forget all of the Robin Hood models, which are taken directly from the financial world, which is why those amounts are so large, is they will hold you accountable to the 5th decimal level. And so they're going to hold you accountable just like a margin call on on Wall Street. If it's 401, tough, give me your keys to your house. They're going to hold you accountable to those numbers. So you need to make sure that if you're willing to take that, you have the backbone and the infrastructure to do all those reporting. So there's a new world out there in terms of sort of measurements and performances that are required. And that's a very difficult thing in the human services piece in terms of sort of inputs versus outputs versus results. And that's something that needs to be quantified in some of the applications and really looked at in the RFPs and really discussed with your board in terms of how they are able to support the differential and use that philanthropic dollars to make it so that the government contracts are only worth 75% and the rest is philanthropic because they need to have all that infrastructure in place to get more dollars.
Right, and Phil, you raise a really good point. I mean, right, there's been a sea change in how the field is funded, how social services are funded over the last 20 years or so. You have to produce outcomes. You have to be able to have the internal capacity to measure your effectiveness, however, whether you describe it as metrics or outcomes or management by objective or whatever this year's phrase is. But that's one of those unfunded capacities. So every funder, whether it's government or philanthropic, wants you to measure your effectiveness. But are they giving you the PhD researchers? This school and others are producing all these people who know how to research those kinds of outcomes and help an organization know what they have to do to produce them. But how do you pay for that person? How do you pay for that evaluation expertise when you're not being
You don't.
paid?
Right, but that's where you have to expand your philanthropic base and have that, whether it's a restricted endowment or a restricted account for savings, because all these things are going to come up that your organization is unaware of. And for more organizations to give to you, they need to see the strength of your organization. They need to see that those debt ratios aren't there. They need to see a strong balance sheet. They will give more. There is money out there to give, but they need to see the strength, not the weakness. And some of that's in the storytelling and the narrative of what you're doing, but some of it comes down to the actual numbers that are on the sheet. And if you show that you're going to be planning for the unknown, planning for new performance measurements, that you're actually sending someone to a particular school to get more learning and teaching about metric systems, or for the unknown classes that may come up that all of a sudden we have to teach people about this particular training session. If you have those, it just makes you stronger and you're showing that you're being more prudent as an executive director in your organization. That allows them to give to both. And what you can also do with that is give a percentage where you can say, for every dollar you're giving me, from a philanthropic side, I'm going to divide X percentage into infrastructure and X percentage into program as well. Because, people love to name the building. Nobody loves to name the bathroom.
Or the furnace,
Okay? But you need it.
or the HR department.
Right.
Right. Fred,
There's another aspect of the report I think is critically important. When I talk about the fact that the systems are designed to fail, it's in large part because the systems are designed by government and by entities outside of the not-for-profit community. So one of the things that we really talked about in this report is really being a part of the program design
Right.
along with government. So instead of just responding to an RFP, if it's a child welfare organization or a mental health service, the professionals are influencing the program design. So you're not responding to an RFP that's already sort of scripted around what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it. We're basically saying, look, we understand this population, we want to bring in innovation, but we also want to make sure that it's successful. And it also speaks to the evaluation component. We've had contracts where they're measuring outcomes that they're not paying for. It's not in the matter of the research component.
Yeah.
You're asking me to improve the employment or the income of a population, but you're not giving me employment counselors or people to work around that area. You're giving me housing specialists and case managers as the model. So it's really about trying to become part of this process whereby we're having a conversation with government. They have a concept. They want to solve a problem. So they state the problem. We influence how that gets designed. They issue an RFP. We respond to the RFP. And that creates an opportunity for us to do programs that are more effective in addressing what the issues are.
Well, and I
That's a
think
really
on
good
top of
point.
that, what it helps do is I think it potentially, everyone's like, okay, so the big question here, if you really fund things at where they are, where's that, if it's 80 cents on the dollars, where's that 20 cents for every contract dollar that we're currently spending coming from if government's, not planning on putting any more
Right,
money
and
towards
Allison,
social
let me just
services.
say, that the reason that government only funds 80% is because they want to save money.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah.
not as if this is like
But they still save
a
money,
mystery.
even
Yeah.
if they put that 20 cents in, they'd still save money compared to what they'd spend if they did it themselves. So
Right.
let's be clear about that. It's not like all of a sudden they'd be not saving money. It's just that they've been, because of the fact that they haven't done any inflationary increases, they're saving more.
Yeah.
But they're not buying good enough stuff, and I think that's the key here. And so if we had a conversation, in a real conversation, a program design moment, in which we said, okay, government, what is it that you want to accomplish? What are the outcomes? And how much dollars are you willing to put towards this problem? We, as providers, could come to the table and say, okay, for that price and that problem, these are the types of things we might be able to do. And that could close the gap in a different way, as opposed to them coming up with a prescriptive approach to solving a problem that doesn't have the dollars behind it to actually accomplish it in the way that they want to.
Right. So you know what, we have some time for questions. I mean, I certainly have many more questions for the panel if there's a vacuum here, but I suspect there isn't. If people have questions for our panel, raise your hand. Yes, and Alan, people introduce themselves when you ask a question?
For the panel, a typical...
Introduce yourself.
I'm Alan Lutz, for those of you who are here on time, you know who I am.
Good memories.
A typical call will get us from a nonprofit agency size of about $1 million to about $8 million. And all of a sudden, they had a balanced budget for the year, projected budget. Now it's also running a debt. Maybe the first time in the agency's history that they have a debt. All of a sudden, the health insurance has increased more than they thought. The staff costs have increased more than they thought. And this is the question to us, which I'd like you to answer. What do I do, Alan? Do I tell my boss? Do I tell the president of the board? Will the board members get so nervous that they're going to leave, or will they help me out? Do I tell city government or state government that's funding me? Will they help me, give me more money, or will they pull away? Do I tell the funders of the private foundations that are funding me? Will they help me, or will they pull away? This is typical question we get, especially from those agencies who've never had a debt before. How do they handle it?
Okay.
So the three of you, and we have agencies like this out there today, very real, practical questions. How do you deal with the all of a sudden the debt?
All right, first Fred, then Phil. Allison, I'll leave you out of this.
So I think there's always debt. But if you have we've had a couple of years where we've run a small negative variance. I think the real question is, do you have a plan to make a course of correction? And is that a viable plan? So the fact that you had something unexpected happen within a particular fiscal year and it results in some losses, the real question is, okay, what do we need to do differently to erase it? But if there's no plan to erase those losses, I think you have to really begin to reevaluate your platform, the services that you're providing, and figure out a way that you can scale back to reduce it. Because again, I think you have a responsibility to the clients that you serve, to your employees, to make sure that the organization is sustainable.
And
So
I
you
gather,
have to make
Fred,
some-
I gather that your board, it wouldn't be the first your board is hearing about this.
Oh, no, no.
In terms-
It better not be. Yeah, I think, again, it's about sort of understanding what the environment is and communicating that and having an expectation that you're not in this alone. So you're having, we have meetings of our finance committee 6 times a year. And if something untoward were to occur in between those meetings, there's a conference call to talk about, here's what's happening, we lost a contract, or more recently, the controller decided to hold up the contracts for programs that were already operating. So for 6 months, we weren't getting paid. And the question was, okay, there's something going on. We understand that there's a battle between the mayor and the controller, and our contracts may be delayed. So the first thing we do is you run a cash flow analysis. It's like, okay, fine, how long can we sustain this? And what's the impact going to be? And we ran it out for a 9-month period, just saying, what if? Okay, and then you sort of have a conversation around what are the things that you can do to protect and defend until that gets resolved.
Phil, you want to
Yes.
tell everyone?
I think you tell everyone. You tell everyone. And first of all, there shouldn't be any surprises. I have a monthly executive committee conference call. And I always say that, no matter what the situation is, whether it's good news or bad news, there should always be sort of an A through F set of options, and F being the failure option. But if healthcare costs have gone up, different situations arise, different expenditures come up, and all of a sudden you're going to be dealing with a cash flow that's different than the one you projected only 2 months ago. It's not just reporting to the board or reporting to management that this has happened and what are we going to do? We're out of money. It needs to be, well, it looks like we're going to be out of money, and here are the 5 plans that we have. And normally somewhere in those 5 plans, because remember plan number 6 is F, it's failure, but somewhere in those 5 plans, there's probably at least 2 of them are different ways of raising revenues, and at least 2 or 3 of them are ways of lowering expenditures. So it's always a combination of those things. The answer cannot be, and is not, let's just fundraise more.
Right.
Or let's get richer board members. Those 2 solutions are nice in the strategic plan document, but they're not good in the cash flow statements.
That's right.
So you need to be able to, again, look at the reality of the situation. And basically, there shouldn't be, surprises like that should not really happen too often. But to your point, where organizations, it's their first time dealing with it, even if it's 9 months out, if they've never dealt with it before, it feels like it's tomorrow, and it feels like it's a shock. But that's where they need to be able to sit down and come up with multiple options and plans. And some of those options and plans can be doing what we just said, which is we need to have a monthly conference call to discuss this, and we need to raise more money, and we need to lower expenditures, and we need to re-strategize exactly how we're looking at RFPs. There's multiple ways of addressing all those things.
You are giving an interim report to a fund, to a foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Would you put that in the interim report that you now project?
Absolutely. I do it all the time. And actually what I normally do, and obviously many of the people here know the organization that I'm working for now, it's a turnaround. We were doing a turnaround at the Africa Center. It used to be the Museum for African Art, which didn't materialize. So, turning that project around is a big endeavor. And what I did was my first 6 months, I didn't email or have any reports. I made personal one-on-one meetings with every single funder that we had, including board members, flying out to their house, one in particular. Most everybody else lived locally, but one person lived out west. But you can't have a conference call to denote these things. You need to have a one-on-one meeting. It's important.
Right, and you have to have an ongoing relationship with your
Yeah.
funders. So if you're going to tell them that you're running a deficit, or it shouldn't be the first conversation you're ever having with your funder.
Right.
So.
And I'll add this because it's important. A lot of the funders that we were dealing with, because at one point I stopped taking grants, and they said, you haven't applied for anything new. And I said, well, I can't be a good steward of it right now. I'm turning things around, and that's difficult. But believe me, as soon as I turn it around and I can be a good steward, I'm going to come back and ask you for money. That conversation and that dead honesty, I walked out of so many meetings with funders where they said, you know what, we could tell things weren't 100% and we were ready to kind of cut you off. But now that you come in, and as Mom always said, the truth is easiest to remember, so just tell the truth. You told us the truth. So now, when you do get it, let us know how we can help you. Maybe we'll issue you a temporary grant to help you with infrastructure and back-of-house strategic planning. And one organization even gave me $100,000 to do a strategic plan analysis because they felt, wow, you're doing things differently. So having those honest yet difficult conversations with your funders is vital.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, sir, and who are you?
My name is Frederick Johnson. I serve as COO for a company called Communion, and my question is for Allison. You mentioned about a cost of living increase that the mayor had that wasn't released. What can be done so it's released?
So Allison, just give a little background on that.
So it's before the cost of living adjustment that was included in the budget that was adopted on July 1 of 2016. No, 2015.
It's almost a year ago.
Yeah, it's
For
almost a year ago.
For those keeping track,
Yeah.
it's almost a year ago.
Almost a year ago. So the budget that was passed on July 1 of 2015 or put into effect then, included a cost of living adjustment of 2.5%, very small amount, I think, given that it had been 6+ years since the last one for the sector. And the one before that, which was 6 years prior, was probably 3%, and before that, it was several years. So there's a history of not having any adjustments to contracts. And it's, just to be clear also, it's only on the personnel side of the budget. So your other than personnel services is not included, which, you know, adds to all these problems that we're talking about. But so it's supposed to go, so it goes directly out to staff. So it's supposed to be, you know, goes right out to staff. The mayor this year has, in the budget that he just released yesterday, I mean, there's still time, I guess, because it gets adopted July, you know, be put in place by July 1 of 2016, did not include another cost of living adjustment. And what I talked about is the fact that the money hasn't gotten out the door from last year. So they're notoriously, as we talk about paperwork we talked about before, they came up with this crazy, very burdensome process in which you had to provide the city with a lot of information about every single staff person on every single contract, which was a new thing, because they wanted to collect information on the workforce in the human services sector that they're contracting with, and so they made providers do this additional work in order to get the 2.5% increase.
Meaning
And
that, so let's say you spend $7 million on staff costs, on personnel costs for your organization.
Right.
They just didn't say to you, okay, we're going to give you 2.5% on $7 million. We're going to look at every personnel line by
Right.
line, and determine whether that person is eligible.
Right.
And so that was, I think, that's the paperwork you're talking about.
Yeah, and so because of that paperwork, and being a new process not just for the providers and nonprofits, but also for the different city agencies, and apparently it not being communicated well, the money hasn't really gone out the door to a lot of the agencies. So while they were promised, and there was a public announcement about a cost of living adjustment going out, it's almost a year later, and the workers are still have not received any adjustment. And I think the thing that really annoys me is that the fact that they are not getting anything after this either.
So how, or what can we do?
Oh, we are continuing to push them. I mean, we're going to release a public statement today and try to get the press attention on the fact that there's not a new one, no less that there's the previous one. It will go out the door. It's actually starting to move now, so it will go. And what we've been doing is really bringing providers to the table and trying to. I mean, we're just constantly pushing. I mean, all you can do is I can keep calling them and pushing them, and that's all we can do.
Directly to the mayor's office.
Yeah. If you feel like calling and annoying them, feel free.
And what we did, we basically, because we had the data, we understood what the impact was going to be, we issued the increases to our employees, but we also made sure that we were extremely aggressive in responding to the requests from the city around the data and then hounding them to follow up on it. So we did get it. It was really
Good.
delayed. But, the first thing that we did was to take a look at, how can we afford to give this to staff and wait for the city to reimburse us? And when the answer was yes, we basically said, because it was in the public news, they were getting a 2.5% increase. I was going to explain to them that I'm waiting for the mayor to give us the money. So
Right.
we gave.
And we did the same thing with the cost of living adjustments, but I tapped the larger source. I increased the board dues by 6% a year every single year. As part of the strategic plan, the board dues go up, because normally you hire a board member, you're like, oh, well, these are your dues, and it's good for your term. I have a 6% increase on board dues every single year, and the reason for that is because we tell them when they come on board, well, if there are cost of living adjustments, and they may take a year or more, and it's not just PS, it's OTPS as well. I could have a 2.5 in PS and an OT and 3% there. I need to be able to have just this 6% increase in your board dues for sustainability.
Yeah, that's smart.
And they get that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, and who are you?
I'm Elizabeth Rogers. I work for a nonprofit in the child welfare program. And our agency got our ACS funds, not our OLH funds. And so the rollout is very challenging for HR and fiscal because they're having to do different rollouts for the funds. But my question is, when the amount goes up to a COLA, the government give any thought to increasing the admin overhead also because this is taking a lot of, so that's.
Sometimes, it depends on the contract.
Wait, did everybody hear the question? She's saying, right, okay, so she's saying, if the personnel costs, if you get a cost of living increase for your personnel, do you get an analogous increase for your admin? Because presumably,
They're working on it.
Right,
On
right,
the
right.
HR, the fiscal, all that, everything, the payroll, IT for doing all this. And so, I know my agency is trying to do, obviously, different agencies with the funders directly, but I'm wondering if that's a conversation broader when they get to that part, is the admin overhead also addressed?
It's always a conversation. We've been having it for years, and we continue to have the conversation, and quite frankly, when you're talking at very high levels, they get it. They understand that your insurance and your health costs and your operating costs and your leasing costs are all going up, and they're just not addressing it. But we are constantly having that conversation.
Well, I mean, I think this is why it's important, frankly, and this is an unpaid pitch. Organizations like the Human Services Council and Homeless Services United, these collections and federations of organizations that can speak with a louder voice than one agency alone. And that really is an important force in the city in trying to change these policies, is organizations banding together. Yes, ma'am. And who are you?
Hi, I'm Karen Simmons. I run a legal not-for-profit that represents children.
Wonderful.
You talk about partnering with the CFO and the CEO, and I'd like to hear a little bit more on how that partnership, that thought partnership works. In particular, when you talk to funders as well as the board, because it sounds like it just sounds like it's a very seamless relationship, and I don't know if it's always seamless in
So
those relationships.
that's a really good question. So why don't we'll start with the CEO and then we'll have the CFO.
So I think it depends on your expectations. I think you first have to make a good hire. So you're looking for someone who
Not as easy as it sounds,
Right,
Fred.
it really isn't, because, the reality is that we're not competitive. You're looking for a CFO, it's a CFO. It's a skill set, okay? And, I'm not just competing with other not-for-profits, I'm competing with industry. So you're looking for someone who is interested in working in this area, recognizing that they're going to make far less money for doing it, but they're going to bring the same level of skill and commitment to this job. Then it's a matter of recognizing that you're going to defer to that person, that you're going to be expecting that person to do the risk analysis, to alert you, to read the contracts, to understand where the flaws are, and to be able to have that conversation with you. I think this is where the risk comes in, associated with just the confidence and of the individuals. Be willing to allow that person to disagree, not only with you, but I think it's really important that they have a direct line of communication to your finance committee of your board and to the audit committee of your board.
Bill?
I agree, and I think it's definitely a marriage. It's a difficult thing to find that right couple.
Sure is.
And otherwise there will be a divorce. You really have to have that.
Well, there'll be splitting by the children.
There could be splitting by the children as well. But it really comes down to really just having an honest relationship as a team. And you're working towards the same goal, whatever the various goal is for the organization. But there needs to be that mutual respect that there are going to be times when the CFO overrules the CEO. Never in front of the board, but in closed doors. And there's going to be times when the CEO says, I hear you, I get it, but we're doing this. And it's important that that balance exists and that everyone understands that. And sometimes those are painful because the CFO tends to look at things from a very pneumatic standpoint. I think that what you really want to be able to find is someone that is looking at strategy as well as numbers. Because numbers only tell part of the story. And I say this at times, so you probably want to, if I had to just do debits and credits, I think I'd kill myself. Those are tools, but they're not what I do. What I'm doing is using those tools as a strategic base for the organization. And your CFO needs to be able to have that mindset that they are a strategic partner with the numbers to achieve the overall mission of the organization. If they're just interested in numbers, then get yourself a good, solid controller or a bookkeeper, and don't pay the salary of a CFO. But if you want to have that partner in that marriage, then you need to be able to find someone that believes in the mission and can really use every sort of tool in their basket to make it succeed.
That's really such a good point. I think we have time for one last question, and I think that's you. And who are you?
Hi, my name is Michelle. I'm a Fordham alum, and I took an executive education certificate at the Westchester campus this May. It was fabulous.
Great.
So, thank you. But my
Another unpaid announcement.
Yeah, right. No, it was fabulous. So, can you talk a little bit? So, I'm a nonprofit capacity builder, and a lot of my clients are grassroots. And I've invited some of them to be here today. So, can you guys, on a positive note, kind of talk about why this work is so hard and why this work is so broken? And yes, nonprofits are supposed to fail because what we're trying to do is fix a very tough problem that we all don't know the answers yet. So if you can just kindly give like some spiritual set the world afire kind of advice, and also some practical, like it's okay to be fundraising for a year and not have programming too.
All right, well, that's okay. So but that's a good way to end, I think, that an uplifting, why it's important to carry on
Yes.
despite all these obstacles and barriers, and of course the reason is because there's hundreds of thousands of people who depend on us to make their lives better. But I mean, that's a broad brush answer, but why don't we just go down the line? Allison, Fred, Phil, do you understand the question?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I think it's because we have to have these services in order to have a prosperous city, state, nation. And so you have to keep figuring out how to get this work done. I think grassroots organizations are particularly important because they don't have that disconnect between what the people on the ground need and what is actually being delivered to them in terms of the help. I do think that they have a real value. They have a very tough time getting access to government dollars, and I think I would like to see that fixed. I think, though, if the large organizations are struggling, I can't imagine what it's like to run a small organization, although in some ways, given what we've said, I mean, they should be thankful that they don't have government dollars because they're not helpful. So I do think that we are actively trying to change the conversation and address this major marketing problem that our sector has about the work it does and why it's important and what our funding structures look like. So I'm very hopeful. I think that for me, this report is helping to push that conversation forward. There's a lot more discussion about the importance of the nonprofit sector as a whole, human services with a specific focus, but there's so many other nonprofits that do other types of work that are important, and I think that conversation is being elevated. And I hope that leads to change that will allow us to do the work that we do and meet our missions in a more meaningful way without so many unnecessary hurdles that are, in addition to just trying to solve the very real problems that our missions are meant to address.
So again, I always said that the systems are designed to fail, but I follow that up by it's a challenge to the people who do this work that we can make it work in spite of itself. So it's not inevitable that it's going to fail. We provide services that are life-saving. I make sure that my staff understand the difference that they make in the lives of the clients that we serve. I make sure that we are sort of committed to mission and staying focused on mission, and that we have a responsibility as managers to sort of smooth the road as much as possible, to move as many obstacles out of the way as we can. I basically approach the work by recognizing that our clients are central to the work. They're the most important sort of commodity component of what we do. And if we're going to do it well, we have to make sure that the people who are closest to those individuals that are being served get everything that they need, the support that they need in order to do it well. And that our function as managers is really a support function. It's really sort of to provide the foundation to make sure that the clients are getting what they need, and they're getting that through the people who are doing the work. So you can be a porter, you can be a child care worker, you can be a case manager. You are central to the work that we do. And that we'll smooth the work. We'll deal with all the things that are going on in the background so that it doesn't get in the way of your ability to do your job.
Yeah, that's Bill?
I'll try and be as positive as I can for you as a finance person. So I'll say this in the same sentence. You can do it, but you can fail. And what I mean by that is all the things that we're discussing today. As a grassroots organization, it's extraordinarily difficult. You don't have access to big donors. Your board is like, your cousin and things like that. You just scraped up enough money to file for nonprofit status. It's extraordinarily difficult. But you also have advantages. There are advantages to not having government contracts too. But what I mean by you can do it, but you can also fail is when you are starting out as a grassroots organization and you're looking to get new donors and new funders and getting people to believe in your mission, you have to show them the strength that you are planning for, that you're planning to have a board of 15 people, and that the board members, there is a diversified plan for that board, that your financial model is a sustainable model. It may not be sustainable until year 6, and by sustainable, I mean break even, because you're just a small grassroots organization. But if you don't show that you are putting in support mechanisms, that you have a plan for the board, you have a plan for the organization, who's going to give you money? Just your cousin, right? Sometimes it's to make you just go away. So you need to show that plan. So you need to be able to have solid business practices that end up being correct for the nonprofit world and allow you to do your mission. And that is what allows sort of small grassroots organizations to operate out of a garage and be more successful. And eventually you'll get to the point where you're dealing with these horrible government contracts. And that's a good problem to have eventually.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Let me just put in a word that Fordham has a Center for Nonprofit Leaders. You heard about it earlier. There's literature out there about the center, which offers both a master's program and a certificate program. And so one of the ways to help the nonprofit sector succeed and avoid the failure lane is to become aware of the skills that you need to run a nonprofit and to be successful. So I hope that you will take advantage of what this university has to offer, as well as to come back to other sessions that we have. I just want to thank old friends and new friends. Thank you. This was a really, really good panel, I think, and laid out the challenges and the joys. I hope some of that came through. The joys of the work, of being mission focused, of doing everything possible to engage clients and fulfill the missions of these organizations. It's really satisfying work. It's really hard work. So, thank you, all of you, for being here. Allison, Fred, Phil. And Elaine, did you want to say something?
Well, I'm going to thank you, Nancy,
for
putting this together. It was just wonderful. I've known Nancy for a long time. When the Missions Committee, I've been in many years ago. So it's really been great that, to have an opportunity to work with her. And
thank you, Elaine.
And this great panel that she brought together. And we really want to be, as one of the directors of the Florida Center for Nonprofit Leaders, we really want to be, on top of very important issues.
Oh, we will.
In New York City. So we're so pleased to sponsor this program. And so please, if you are interested, I know we have many students and alums from our different programs here, but tell your friends, invite others if they want to get involved with our center. They want to come to a certificate program, they want to come to a master's program, but they just want to talk to us, have them contact us. We're Fordham.edu/nonprofits. is our, is our website. I'm sure you probably all picked up material. And if anyone wants to contact me directly, my email is very simple, congress@fordham.edu. And it's spelled just like it sounds, just like.
Lady, you want to mention the seminar on soldiers and suicide?
Right, yes, we're having it. Our next seminar will be on veterans and suicide, because I'm sure you probably have been reading about veterans, and this is a real concern about suicide. So, and our Francis Petit, our partner from the business school, was instrumental in introducing us to the veterans group. So this will be a very exciting program. It's going to be on May 9th. Please join us. And now you're on our list, so you'll be getting all kinds of emails from us about different activities. So we're really glad that you all come and keep in touch. And thanks for our panel. They're just a story.
Yeah.